one day.
It has been 50 years since Dr. Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech that ended with him saying, "Let freedom ring." Well, this week in every state in the U.S., bells sounded simultaneously to mark the ending of those famous words. Let's have a look back at history.
To dismiss the magnitude of this progress, to suggest, as some sometimes do, that little has changed, that dishonors the courage and the sacrifice of those who paid the price to march in those years.
President Barack Obama urging tens of thousands who gathered in the National Mall to become modern-day marchers for the kind of economic justice and racial harmony dreamed of by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and those who marched with him.
Because they marched, the civil rights law was passed. Because they marched, a voting rights law was signed. Because they marched, doors of opportunity and education swung open so their daughters and sons could finally imagine a life for themselves beyond washing somebody else's laundry or shining somebody else's shoes. Because they marched, city councils changed and state legislatures changed and Congress changed and yes, eventually the White House changed.
Taking stock of the progress made and what is still to come, Americans of all backgrounds and colors stood where King's dream was spoken of 50 years ago. It was a moment rich with history and symbolism, the first black American president standing where King first sketched his dream. Entertainer Oprah Winfrey said Martin Luther King Jr. forced the nation to wake up, look at itself, and eventually change.
So we ask ourselves, what are we doing for others to lift others up? And as the bells toll, we must recommit to that the love that abides and connects each of us to shine through and let freedom ring.
Winfrey said the civil rights leaders' lessons still inspire people all over the world. Former President Bill Clinton recalled the impact of King's words 50 years ago.
The choice remains as it was on that distant summer day 50 years ago. Cooperate and thrive, or fight with each other and fall behind.
And of course, the famous words, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." So the question is, how far has the United States come in improving race relations? Again, we have Dee Dee Benkie and Dr. Bart Rossi. We also are joined by Dr. Tibbs. Thanks for joining us here.
Thank you for having me on.
Let's talk about where we have come so far. We'll just kind of go right down the line, get everybody's perspective 50 years later. Dee Dee, let's start off with you.
Well, I have to say, even though I didn't vote for President Obama, and I don't agree with him all the times, I'm thrilled he's a black president. I think that's so good for us, and I think it's something we should be proud of. And I do think that what Dr. Martin Luther King did just changed our country. It changed in the way he went about trying to help race relations. It was peaceful. I mean, he was so dynamic and incredible. And anytime you hear the speeches from 50 years ago, it's very, very inspiring.
And that speech, of course, is credited with helping spur passage of sweeping civil rights laws. It's just amazing that that speech alone did that. It's just incredible. Dr. Tibbs.
Yes, it wasn't just a speech though, right? The speech had carried with it some very significant content, but it was also the amount of people that were involved in trying to make the nation change, wanting to see the nation change. And this actually speaks to a lot of what Dr. Martin Luther King stood for. It wasn't just about African Americans fighting for racial equality. It was about all people fighting for racial equality, black, white, brown. And I think the presence of everyone at not only the first March on Washington, but also the anniversary of it, speaks loudly about the way that America has not only progressed, but also the way in which America is continuing to progress.
And talk to us about some of your own personal work.
Yeah, so I do a lot of work in civil rights history, particularly civil rights legal history from the 1950s to the 1980s. And so dealing with both the civil rights era and the post-civil rights era, the Black Power era, I'm very stricken by how the presence of people being involved, the social movements, the way in which America sort of connects to itself, the ways in which we come into our own racial realities speak loudly about the American conscience and about the way that America perseveres as well.
Dr. Bart, we haven't heard from you.
Yeah, I was really taken back by
how far we've come. The other day, I thought the speeches were just wonderful. I thought that even Carter just gave some insight into what happened years ago that was quite extraordinary. He noted that the buses had a black stripe on it so that the buses weren't even equal in those days. So
it's amazing to hear from some of the older people.
Yeah, so when you hear things like that. But I also think that it was striking to me and very sad that the GOP was not represented. All members of Congress were invited, and specific emails were sent out as to where some of our leaders would be, and they were on the Republican side and they weren't there. And I thought that was a really lost moment.
Now, I know that Dee Dee has a rebuttal on that one. Dee Dee?
No, I agree with Dr. Bard. I think it's ridiculous. I don't know what their problem was. I mean, I really think it's sad. I agree. Michael Still, who is former Republican National Committee Chairman, love the guy, and I agree with him completely. He was the only black Republican National Committee member we had. I voted for him, supported him, was very upset when he didn't win, and he said, you know what, it was a shame, and I agree with him. So I hope next year it changes.
I just think it was an opportunity to be. I don't say against the Republican Party. I just think they missed a
I don't get it.
I don't either.
I'm with you.
I mean, particularly since the Republican Party is interested in sort of admitting right now that it wants to be more racially inclusive, that it wants to have open its ranks a little bit so that it doesn't seem so closed off and so dichotomized in terms of race. And so this was very striking. That was to me as well, you know, to see that the presidents, all the past presidents were there except the Bush administration. And so that was, I think they missed a huge opportunity.
He was recovering. I mean,
no, I understand. No, I'm saying I'm not. Yeah, I'm saying the administration.
Yeah, right. But I agree. I am not going to defend that. I think it's wrong, and I think I hope next year they try to somehow make up for it, but not good.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the racial divide, if you will, about race relations. Now, there was a new Gallup poll. 40% of African Americans say there is a lot of discrimination still. 15% of white people say there is.
I'd like to just say that. I've said this before on this show, but I think there's two Americas right now.
Yeah.
Basically, under 40, and there's some people obviously over 40, but there's a movement for folks under 40 and others, of course, that is more progressive. Society's really going in a certain direction. And for some people on the other side, the other half of this, is that they're stuck in the old way of thinking, and there is some under the surface bias. There's racism. We just saw the clown at the rodeo. We just saw stuff that's basically just flat out racist.
You're saying that the younger generation is more open-minded, especially with gay rights even?
Absolutely.
Right.
Okay.
And sometimes they might not even, you know, a lot of times you don't come to understand racial realities until you have experienced them. And so in the ways in which perhaps race is pushed back a little bit more in having open interactions between individuals, the younger generation might not even realize perhaps when racism is occurring because of the way that now it's much more covert than it once was perhaps 50 years ago where it was much more overt.
Well, it's upsetting to me because as a Republican, man, I don't know any racists. I don't know people who think that way, but why didn't they show up? I don't get it. Why didn't the leaders make that extra effort? It's very upsetting to me. And I looked up what Michael said exactly. He said it was a boneheaded move, and he's right. I'm ashamed of it. I feel terrible.
Think of the psychology of this. Suppose Boehner and Paul Ryan and everybody else showed up and they made some nice comments.
As they should.
It would have looked entirely different.
It would have looked like we were together as a nation, which is what we all wanted to be, and that's what Dr. Martin Luther King wanted for us. And this is the 50th anniversary. We don't get to do this for another 50 years.
What do you think he would say if he were alive today and just not just what would happen with the GOP not showing up, but just in terms of race relations in general? What do you think he would say? I mean, I would think that he'd be very proud.
I think he'd be, as I said before, a walking conflict because I think he would be very proud of what's happened, and I think he'd be pleased. But on the other hand, I think that he would look at the other side of America that's still holding on to some racist views and try to move forward against that as well.
I think he would definitely be concerned about things that are still plaguing the African American community. So admitting the progress, obviously, of having the first president of the United States being an African American, he still would have to be able to reconcile that with things like mass incarceration, gun violence, things that are still, you know, plaguing the African American community: poverty, joblessness, homelessness, lack of funding for education. Those are things that were present during the 1950s, and some of them are still present today.
And in fact, President Obama cited economic security as a still elusive goal for many African American men, especially.